Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I am going to be the administrator for today's live book signing event. We will send you a signed copy, signed on our custom Abraham Lincoln Bookshop book plate. You're going to have a chance to see one of those here in just a second. With that out of the way, I would like to introduce you to your host for today's event, Daniel Weinberg from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Thank you, Bjorn, and welcome to A House Divided, where at least I'm in the broadcast studio of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and hopefully someday we'll have our authors more back in here as we used to do. But we're happy to have Scott Ellsworth here with us today. He's a former historian at the Smithsonian Institution, now a professor of history at the University of Michigan. He writes for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and elsewhere. He's the author of at least 5 books, including The Secret Game, which was the winner of the 2016 Penn ESPN, I should say, Award for Literary Sports Writing, and also The Groundbreaking, which was a critically acclaimed account of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. His latest book is this one, Midnight on the Potomac, The Last Year of the Civil War, The Lincoln Assassination, and The Rebirth of America. Is published by Dutton, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House, 320 pages, and is $32 plus post. And so this is what the book place will look like if we run out of, because Scott was here at our shop briefly, actually signed books again right here. We have some left still, and maybe later on too, but here are some books that you can buy right now that are actually signed by Scott, which is nice. The other thing is we have first editions. And as I'm fond to say, those of you who have listened to this over the years, first editions are not scarce, second editions are scarce. And so congratulations, Scott. You're in at least the second edition, we found out. So congrats on that. So first of all, let's get what everyone is wondering about and asking about, and that is this book is dedicated in loving memory of Elmer W. Ellsworth, U.S. Army Air Corps, 1942 to 46, and Helen Solberg Ellsworth, U.S. Army Arctic, Desert, and Tropic Information Center from 1942 to 45. But what about Elmer Ellsworth, our guy here that we know, first Union soldier, shot in the American Civil War, an ancestor?
Well, the fact is, we don't know. And I guess Elmer Ephraim Ellsworth, the Zouave officer, to my knowledge, did not have children. But the problem is there's some connection between the lines of the family. And the problem is that in 1912, when my dad was 5, his father, whose name was Herbert Elmer Ellsworth, deserted the family, never to be heard from again. We've tried and tried to learn about him. He served in the Philippines and the troubles there at the turn of the century. He had been born in Canada, but we don't really know anything about his family. So I'm hoping one day we'll be able to either get some genealogy done, but maybe even possible to do some, DNA genealogy as well too, if we can somehow connect the rest of the family. So I don't know. It's very suspicious that you have both my dad and his dad were also named Elmer Ellsworth as well.
Well, then you're going to be an honorary ancestor or descendant, I should say, of Elmer Ellsworth, who was like a son to our man, Abraham Lincoln.
Absolutely.
Now,
Absolutely.
listen, you told us when you were in before to sign some books that as a youngster you began looking at Civil War because of illustrated books and the illustrations that just brought you in. I know many did that with Lincoln with 20 Days by the Kunharts. I'm surprised in a way not to see many illustrations at all in this book to bring people in, but it's not really made for children. Whom was this book written for?
So I write, I wrote my first book it came out in 1982. So I've been doing this for a long time. But I had gone to graduate school at Duke and all of that, but I decided I didn't want to be a college professor and worked for 10 years at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History after I'd published my first book and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. But a great lesson that I learned from the Smithsonian is that the American people are really interested in American history. They just aren't interested in the way that most scholars write about it. And scholarly books have become less and less accessible to the general public. So I very much wanted to write for a general audience. I wanted to write for an audience that would include women, as women buy 65% of all books. And there's other reasons for that as well, too. But for people who don't who know who fought in the Civil War, but and have a vague sense of it. But I wanted to write something, for those folks as a way to bring them into this really important story. But but behind that, Dan, as I did a lot of research, and everything is backed up by lots of scholarship. And I wanted, even though I don't write for scholars, it's certainly based on fact and on truth, and wanting to write a book that was solid and to
Exactly.
make a contribution to the.
Exactly. And I might uh, open that envelope a little bit.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
finding that, yes, academia is still there, but I'm finding that the books that are coming out now in our field are written more and more for a little more general public with great scholarship, and not all historians like yourself trained that way who are doing it. This is certainly a page turner, and it's an exciting read, I found. And there it is structured in short chapters
Mhm.
that really want you to get to the next chapter and the one after that and the one after that. It's a good writing technique. And people, if you're trying to go to sleep at night, do it beforehand because you won't. You're going to want to read the next chapter. Um, One reason is that it's good writing technique and keeps you going. I'm just curious, is this also because we're all imbued with shorter extension spans of attention? Is that part of this? But
Absolutely, that's absolutely part of it. I mean, part of it was the fact that, the book is, I mean, the narrative isn't 300 pages. I can't remember what it is. It's two
320.
something. And there's just a lot of stuff I had to cram in if I didn't want to write a door stopper. So there were a lot of decisions that had to be made in terms about leaving out certain things, but also being fairly concise and really trying to get descriptions of events that allowed the reader to hear things, to smell things, to feel the wind, whatever it is, and to be there in a novelistic sense.
Yeah.
Um, but I teach at a university. I've taught now for nearly 20 years. Attention spans are shorter. The young people aren't reading as much. And I wanted to have a book that would not be daunting for high school students. I've had middle school students read the book and write back to me, but to have something for, adults as well too. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Wanting to write something that was fast paced, kept the reader involved, and it was in digestible chunks.
Yeah, and it works, and I recommend it to, I guess, middle school up to my age in the 80s. And I think you'll enjoy this as a read of history, a certain moment in history. Now, what about the Civil War buff who knows something? The Lincoln person who knows something. I would tell these people that you're going to have a good read about something you know. You're going to enjoy reading about something you know, but you'll always find something in here. I did little bits that I didn't know or you won't know. Just will say, "Oh, I didn't know that," and will keep you going anyway. What would you say to the Civil War buff and why he should pick this book up or
Well,
she?
I think you're going to find, well, a couple reasons. One is that this is what you just said has been a constant refrain since the book has come out. I've been on a book tour. I've spoken in St. Louis and Tulsa and Washington, D.C. and New York City, in Boston. I'm, between now and Christmas, I'm going to lots of other places as well too. And I keep hearing from people at these readings, but also online, people will write to me and say, I thought I knew everything and I just kept finding new stuff. And part of that, part of that is probably due to my approach to it. I mean, in terms of once I realized what I thought the parameters of the story were, then I use rather than I'm going to follow the script that Bruce Catton did or Shelby Fitz did. You always write about this certain event in this way. I came at it at a slightly different angle as well. And I think that allowed to do it. But in trying to have the prose be something that captivates readers, I was always looking for little emotional bits, little bits of detail, things that would stick with readers on and on. And when you're writing a larger, if you're writing the history of the wilderness or Spotsylvania, you've got a lot of work to do that you want to do. I have to condense it, and I want to keep the reader engaged. So I think part of it was that, and part of it was just being somebody who's I'm 71. I've been interested in history for 60 years and have been reading about it and writing it. So there's certain things you learn along the way as well. You
Yeah.
realize, oh, that's
And
something new. That's
and
kind of a
it's positively we get that. The research shows that. Um, and in fact, the notes in the rear are valuable, I think. They give readers suggestions if they want to go more deeply into a subject that interests them in the main body of the book. Although I found that some of these research areas to go to are links, I kept tapping them in the book. It didn't go to it.
oh
So
dang. Oh
I'll
well,
ha
oh, the physical book.
I'll have to do something else, I guess. But how did you view accompanying notes and the little Greek chorus that you give in there as well, talking about something more that would not be great in the narrative?
Yeah, well, and that was really for the experts and the next generation of scholars and the Civil War buffs too, and for general readers who wanted to go deeper. I mean, so my publisher at Dutton Penguin Random House and my previous publisher, my most recent previous one at Little Brown, they were both into having endnotes rather than having footnotes, and I understood
Yeah.
that. And I didn't want to make them dry, and there were a lot of things I wanted to talk about in the notes themselves and also direct readers. I was just looking at the note on what are the notes on Sherman, and I was able to use that to talk about how it was really British scholars and British army officers and others who really were the first to discover the genius of many of the generals in the Civil War on both sides. And I thought that's interesting. That's something that most readers aren't going to know because these books by Hart and other people are hard to come to, not at your bookstore. But I wanted to give people a sense of the larger resonance of things, but also there's some really interesting stories out there. And
Yes.
there was a ways that I could address sort of problems in some of the historiography. We'll go into this, but I mean, if you combine the as many of your listeners will know, if you consider the Battle of the Wilderness in Spotsylvania as one battle, and there's reasons not to do that, but if you put them together, it's the largest battle of the Civil War. And yet, if you go to Spotsylvania or to, you're not going to find these big visitor centers like you have
No.
at Gettysburg. There's hardly any monuments in these battles as well, too. And I wanted to bring up why I thought that was. So these
Sure.
these give me sort of the notes give me chances to contribute what I hope are interesting views on things that wouldn't, as you're right, wouldn't fit into the narrative itself.
I read that note as well about Sherman, how it was the British who first felt that the generals in the United States, some of them at least, were worth something. And
Yeah.
Sherman, certainly with Liddell Hart, was one of those. And I hope that our viewers will think about going into the notes, seeing something like a classical scholar, historian like Liddell Hart, who's a good writer as well, and not just read the most recent book on Sherman or whomever, but go back to some of the others like Alan Nevins and Liddell Hart and others like that. There's a lot to glean from the older ones. I wanted to ask you about the structure of the book as
Sure.
well, because there's something that you put in here which is kind of interesting. And there are a couple of intermissions that you put in. Now, when I saw the intermission, I uh, went back to my childhood and I remember some of the horror films in the 50s, especially one had a fright break. And just before the climactic scene of horror, they would stop the film, put a clock on, and it was tick down 30 seconds as a fright break. So I wondered, oh my gosh, is this a fright break? I should walk away. But I don't think that's what it was for. So please explain their function. It's even in a different typeface,
Right,
and there is one of the few illustrations, but it's an illustration that is there.
right.
Tell us about those intermissions that you put in.
So once as I was thinking about writing the book, and again, you're just spot on, Dan, in terms of trying to write books for a broader section of modern readers. There's a lot of book clubs where all they do is they read novels, and there's nothing wrong with that. But occasionally they'll read one history book, and I wanted to have a book that could maybe appeal to some of those folks. So, and certainly writing a lot about Booth as an actor, I thought, why not put it into a three-act structure? Let's just call them acts, but I wanted to insert as well, take us off of we're following along these stories and things are getting good and we're about to go. But I realized I need to explain some other stuff, take a historical break and do that. So I use this idea of, entr'actes or intermissions to do that. So that was a way just to, and the designer at the press, they came up with the idea of having different typefaces and things like that, which was fine. And but it was a way to signal to the reader, okay, we've got this story, we're rolling along. Now we're going to stop for a few pages. And so we can kind of understand the settings of other things and what's going on in a more general sense.
In a broader sense, go on top of it and think and give them some background for the next time and next chapters
Right.
to continue on with. I don't want to go into this too far, but I do, but you say this and we need to know about it. Uh, you say that the book covers what you call a time to fight for the soul of the nation. What is that takeaway that we should have for the soul of the nation?
Now, remind me where I say that. I say that
Uh,
in
I
early
think
on
I
or
think that's early on, yeah,
okay.
in the beginning, yes.
All right. Well, that
But we
that
can go beyond that if you'd like. We'll get to more of this book.
okay, sure. Is it the notion that it's a time to fight now for the soul of the nation or a time to fight then is what I'm trying to remember the
I think
context.
it was then, back then.
Okay. Well, it's look,
Or
I
riff on that.
well, no, I mean I can riff on it a little bit, but here would be a couple of the key points. One key point is, and your customers know this, but this to this day, the American Civil War is the single most important event in all of American history. It even more so than the American Revolution. It is the time when questions about who we are as Americans, what we believe, and who is going to be allowed to take part in this world's greatest
Mm.
experiment in democracy. These questions are absolutely at the forefront of public debate. It's all what these things are all about. And then, of course, as we all know, the Civil War is at the same time, it's the bloodiest war in our history. I and likely you and Bjorn as well were raised by the World War II generation. My dad was a veteran. My mom worked for the Army. All of my uncles were fighting in the Pacific or elsewhere. All of my Boy Scout leaders, Little League coaches, all of that. In fact, on the block I lived, you knew that Mr. Lamberton was a B-17 bombardier over Europe. You knew that this guy was this, all that. And so, in World War II, one out of every 300 Americans dies in the war. For Vietnam, it was one out of like 4,000 or something. For the Civil War, it's one out of every 50 families. There's not a family that's not touched by this. And during the course of the Civil War, one out of every seven Americans goes from being enslaved to being free. So this is such an important moment, and the fight over whether the Confederacy is going to survive as an independent nation or whether the Union is going to continue, and the fight over slavery is absolutely for the soul of the country. Absolutely.
Well, I think you answered the question that I was
Good.
asking. That was very good and very true. Um, so let's get into the book itself.
Great.
Um, it covers the last year and a half and year and a quarter of the war and the assassination. Um, you talked near the beginning about Washington, D.C. And let's talk about that as a place.
Sure.
Um, you describe it well. I know that Margaret Leach's Reveille in Washington was the one that I grew up with that was just spectacular and well worth, if you want to go further into what you've done, Reveille in Washington by Margaret Leach won a Pulitzer, well worth going for.
It's a
Um,
masterful book that is sadly forgotten. It should be a Library of American volume. It is just that good.
I
Absolutely.
agree with you on that. Now, you were also then you went into how women and the black population uh, transformed the
Yeah,
city during the Civil War. So how, and also contrabands,
right.
not only the freed blacks that were there, but the contrabands as well. You want to explain that a bit for us?
Sure, and part of that goes back to another issue that makes the Civil War so key, which is the Civil War is the first modern war in world history, and it doesn't start off that way. I mean, at Bull Run, it looks like a Napoleonic war with neat lines of infantry, but 4 years later, at Petersburg, in the mud and the trenches, it looks a lot like World War One, and that was recognized early. But it's also the first total war in that the entire societies are mobilized to fight in this war, and that includes a lot of women. Black people are very key in this as well too. So while there may be just very few women combatants, women are keeping the farm going, they're keeping the store going, they're keeping the family fed and all of that. And this is an important part of the story. And frankly, in the Confederacy, you will run into account after account how while at certain times some of the men were flagging, the women were refusing to flag. They were as determined to have the Confederate States of America remain an independent nation as anyone else. So I wanted to bring them into the story to give us a fuller picture of the war that's going on. And a lot of that ground hadn't been trod, quite frankly. And I was fortunate to run into some just great sources. Amanda Aiken, a loyal New Yorker who goes to Washington and works as a nurse. Her diary is just filled with all these details. There's a wonderful journalist I'm sure we'll talk about later,
We will.
Lois Adams,
Yeah.
and so getting those voices, but the African American impact on the war is crucial, and it's transformative in Washington. I think you'll know better than me, but I think the population of the District of Columbia or Washington was 70,000 or something in 1860. We have 40,000 formerly enslaved African Americans moved to Washington during the war. It changes the city forever. And I wanted to bring those up because that's all a part of what's going on in the milieu, and it has a big impact on the fight itself.
There was even an African American parade, July 4th of 1863, that I guess I wasn't really aware of.
Right.
And that was certainly transformative right in front of the white population.
Absolutely, absolutely, and shocking for many of the white population
Yeah.
as well, where you had thousands of school-aged black children, many of whom had been enslaved, and they're carrying American flags and marching from the White House to the Capitol, or vice versa. I can't remember which, but this is very important, and there's a lot of civil rights struggles that go on in the city as well too.
Um, you talk about City Point.
Right.
And of course, City Point was uh, had great impact, as you say. The impact cannot be overestimated, as you say it, in the war. We happen to have right now, strangely enough, a telegram
Oh,
from
wow.
March 2nd, another one from March 3rd, signed by Assistant Secretary of Navy Fox, ordering the Bat and the River Queen to get ready to have the president board them, I think at 1 p.m. And this one is for tomorrow noon. The president will be in the River Queen bound for City Point. And
That's
of course, this is
amazing.
when he was going to meet Grant and others near the end in March of 65.
That
So
is
this is,
what a piece of history that is. That
and I
is
have both
astonishing.
this and another one the next day, the day before getting it, or this one getting prepared for the next day. This is history in your hand. It
That's
really is.
absolutely amazing.
But
Amazing.
tell us about City Point and why it cannot be overestimated.
Well, it cannot, and I don't know this, so you may know this, Dan, but I don't, you know, there might have been some sort of a European precursor to it, but I can't think of one right offhand. But it's this massive military staging ground, docks, ships and ships and ships loaded into it, very highly organized, what's going to be the headquarters, the military headquarters for the final campaign in Virginia. And the Confederates, of course, realized its value as well too. Had a terrorist act, set charges, blew up ships. I believe 300 people died in that attack, largely African American workers. But this is a whole. This is not how the war was going to be fought back in 1861. This is a new development, and it's a huge leap ahead in terms of military strategy. So it's a vital story. The war. I'm just astounded. Do you remember, Dan, how you got those telegrams or where they came from?
Actually, there are five telegrams that I bought all together. Two of them were the 1865, March of 1865, preparing the River Queen and the Bat. The Bat was supposed to take him down first, but
Right.
then Mary wanted to come along,
Yeah.
Mary Lincoln and her entourage. So they needed a larger boat. So they got the River Queen and put the Bat in front to act as an escort.
Right.
And so that's what this was. And then there were others some years, a couple of years before that, where they were all, the president again was going down to City Point because he went down a number of times.
Yeah.
And so they all came at once. I was amazed to have that, but I have to admit, Scott, here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, 53 years I've been here. It's an 87, 88-year-old bookshop now. And we almost always get something like this coming in every year or three,
That's
something really significant that brings one back. You have history in one's hands. That's
what
what collecting
it's just
artifacts is
yeah.
about.
It's just amazing. And for anyone, I made my first visit to the shop earlier this year, and it is I've talked about it online. I mean, this is an American jewel. This is a true
Oh,
American
thank you.
jewel in Chicago. This is a beacon of our democracy, of our
Mm.
history. The things I've seen have just blew me away. What I love about the telegrams is because both the River Queen and City Point play such an important role in the book as well too, and just
Yes,
to have
exactly.
something associated with them. But I'm that is so cool. I had not seen those. Those are
Well,
great.
thank you for your kind words, but all of these questions are something that comes from your book, and the viewers will find that laid out in a narrative fashion that will amaze you and keep you informed. You'll love this book because of that, all this that Scott has put in. So City Point, yes, is in there. You mentioned already Spotsylvania in the wilderness and how they're almost like twin battles.
Right.
Uh, you had to have taken, of course, for 64, you don't have Gettysburg isn't in there, and Petersburg is in there later,
Right.
but the earlier ones are not. You can't put them in. But tell us, how did the North react to these two battles, the Wilderness, my Lord, the numbers who died and how Grant took a hit for the numbers of men he threw in and kept throwing in who burned up, for heaven's sakes, in the Wilderness.
Well, it was a disaster, and it was a disaster because, one thing I remind my students, but also we should keep this in the back of our mind. The end of the Civil War was never preordained. Okay. Now the Confederate flag was never going to fly over Central Park in New York or Boston Common or
Yeah.
anything like that. But the question was whether the Confederacy was going to survive as an independent nation, or whether the states that had seceded would it be able to return to the Union and maintain slavery. Okay, so that's the issue right there. And that was always up in the air, and it was up in the air in 61 and 62 and 63. After the high water mark of the Confederacy, it's not a mopping up, operation in the war at all.
No.
You know, and in the early spring of 1864, there was a great belief in the North because you had the largest army ever gathered in the Northern Hemisphere. You had this new commander, General Grant, who's a proven fighter. There was this great belief that once the spring campaign began, that there was no question that the war was going to be over by the fall. That they're going to destroy Lee's army, they're going to capture Richmond, it's all over. So there's all of this optimism that goes out, and instead, what happens is Grant and the Army of the Potomac run into this buzzsaw first at the Wilderness, where it's such a dense forested area, heavy underbrush, regular tactics don't work. Lee is waiting for them. And in the end, there are 17,000 Union casualties at the Wilderness. A week later, at Spotsylvania, where the fighting was the most intense of the war, it's arguable, there are 18,000 Union casualties. So Grant has lost roughly nearly a third of his army. A couple weeks later, the siege begins at Petersburg. The war is not going to end at all. And the morale hit that the loyal citizens of the North took was incredible. So instead of headlines of victory, all of this, they had death lists running in newspapers in Harrisburg and New York and Boston and Washington, D.C. and Chicago, list after list after list. And what happens is that now this Northern peace movement, who is now saying, let's just let the South go. Let's be done with this. Let's just divide as a country, is
Yeah.
gaining steam. So this has a terrible impact on morale in the North and is a gigantic problem for Lincoln and his cabinet and his generals.
We'll come up to that a bit. You must have, first of all, just a comment on what you just said. In the book, you have to scrunch it down, but one really has the emotional feel of these twin battles, and you feel there and what it was like. And the feel of it is something that you put into words that the general reader and buffs are going to enjoy going through. It will bring emotions up to you. It must have been difficult, though, to take out certain things. I was thinking, I was waiting for the crater to
Right.
come up, but
The
it's not
grader
there
gets
because,
a paragraph at best.
yeah, you
I
didn't
was
have the
very
time.
lucky though too. I'm as you all figured out, I'm not at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop right now in Chicago and going to visit it. But I'm at the University of Michigan campus, and right outside my window, I could hit with a baseball the second largest university library in the United States. This is one of the great libraries of the world. They have everything. If they don't have everything, they will get it for you. And when I wrote the chapter on the wilderness, I probably had over 100 books checked out, all these regimental histories, all these, published diaries and memoirs of officers and things like that. So I was able to go through lots of material, but looking for those little details that would bring to life what was going on, or to do something about the emotional life of the soldiers and others who were there. So I was very fortunate in that, and that's what I was gunning for, to give again the general reader, who's never heard of Spotsylvania or a vague memory of hearing the wilderness. and realize how important they are and how important they are
Yeah.
to the fate of our nation.
The other thing that you went into then, where I want to keep going on here, I got to admit, was Sherman's March,
Yeah.
and you certainly put that into a perspective that was fascinating for me as well. And any reader will enjoy that. You likened it to a flowing river,
Yeah.
but the other flowing river were also the slaves that freed themselves with their feet going into the army of Sherman, and they had to take care of all of a sudden all of this humanity that was coming with
Yeah.
them. Um, you're right that a new America was being born.
Absolutely. And I mean, and it was unsuspected. I mean, Sherman is, as you know, this great genius. He figured out, no modern general had done what he did, which is we're going to get rid of supply lines. I'm just going to take off into enemy country. I'm going to forage. And he had studied the census tables, the agricultural tables in the 1860 census. He knew there was going to be enough food for his soldiers to live off of. And so he takes this great leap into the unknown, but African Americans, the enslaved, realizes this is our chance. And so it begins as a trickle and it just becomes a flood as tens of thousands of African Americans who are liberating themselves start to follow the army, and they'll do anything for the Union soldiers. um, Sherman, who was no racial liberal by any means, was sort of flummoxed of this, but he's realizing they're teaching him things he doesn't know, and these formerly enslaved people are also doing anything they can do to help the soldiers. They're having to feed themselves. They're marching barefoot and in ragged shoes as many miles as Sherman's army does, and we think of the march as being only a march of destruction. And of course, he's destroying things on the way. It's important to point out he told his soldiers never to burn the houses of yeoman farmers or anything. So it's the mansions that are getting burned, and these people have power. And after the war, they are making that the story. But the real story is the brilliance of Sherman and his army in doing this, but it's this massive self liberation. And there's a quote I found that I love from a Wisconsin soldier who said that, in terms of the impact that these newly freed people were having on them, he said that he thought the entire volunteer army were now abolitionists because
Hmm,
they'd seen what's going on.
nice. That was a great quote. I saw that. Um, just because it's in the index and I saw it in the and I read about it as well, the telegraph. It's always been curious to me how Lincoln used the telegraph even during a battle to be
Yeah,
a part of that battle. And
yeah.
but Jeff Davis, an ex-Secretary of War, for heaven's sakes, didn't use it. Now, maybe because the South didn't have the wherewithal to have telegraph all over the place, and the North did. What is your brief thought on the telegraph in the war?
Well, I think it's a crucial weapon, and there is a huge difference. I don't have it in front of me right now, but there's an effort. I want to think it's at um, Case Western, but I could be wrong on that. But professor there about the history of the American telegraph, and they are doing this absolutely spectacular work and using, going to all of, antebellum newspapers and figuring out where every telegraph line was.
Oh,
They're marking all this incredible online maps. You can find it in the notes to Midnight on the Potomac. But no, uh,
yes.
the North, they were much interestingly, they saw the value of the telegraph, whereas in the South, again, there weren't as many lines, but that was a key. That's one of the other breakthroughs of the Civil War. Why the Civil War is so important is that you have these breakthroughs in technology that are going to change it. And there were also some that were not exploited, but would be of huge importance later on in the First World War as well.
You alluded to what was coming up. You didn't mention it, but the election of
Yeah.
1864 and the soldiers' vote was so important in that. Uh, so, what was the import of the soldiers' vote on Lincoln and McClellan, for that matter?
Well, and it's to remember a couple things. One is that, McClellan had been extremely popular amongst the Union
Yeah.
soldiers. And of course, cynics would say, well, that's because he never sent them into battle. And, so they liked him for that reason. But
Mm.
very popular, a sense that he was going to get the soldiers' vote. But, once Lincoln's campaign, which had been in the ditch, got wind in its sails after Sherman captured Atlanta in particular, um, people realized in the North that the soldiers were gonna they were gonna stick with Lincoln. So this massive effort was made, directed by the federal government. We've had all of these silly debates over mail-in voting. There was extensive mail-in voting by the Union Army during the Civil War, but there were also other efforts made to bring certain units, geographical units, back to their home states if mail-in voting was not allowed, to make sure that they would be back on Union, on election day, and this massive effort to get the soldiers to vote, and the soldiers' vote was important, certainly in Lincoln's victory, no doubt about
I'm trying to get toward the end of the book with
it.
Secret
And
Service
we've
and the
skipped a bunch of stuff
assassination.
as well. So
Yeah, I know. But I have a list of some of the book characters I wanted to just mention,
sure.
have you mentioned. We're not going to go into many of them because they're wonderful. You found some amazing quotes from people and people that are not really known. One is Lois Adams.
Yeah.
Tell us about her. A
Lois
journalist that
Adams
you
was
say was really noteworthy during this war.
Oh, she's amazing. So she was a farmer's wife and a mother of children. Her husband died. She became, a single mom. But her children might have been adult age by the time of the war. And she became the correspondent for Detroit newspapers, the Washington, D.C. correspondent for Detroit newspapers. And I think she's the great unsung journalist of the Civil War. There was a wonderful librarian at Central Michigan University a few years ago who figured out, look at these amazing stories. She was so penetrating in her insights and her descriptions of what's going on in Washington at the time. And she collected them into a book of her writings. And I'm sure you'll have it for sale at some point at the store. But I just found her slant on things to be so different and so revealing of what was going on in the city that I used her as much as I could because her stuff is just golden.
Yeah, she's reoccurring throughout, and I'm
Yeah.
glad she was. You found things that she said that I had never heard in that regard as well. I did want to show maybe the reason my bookshop exists is John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah.
Without martyrdom, I don't think there would have been an Abraham Lincoln bookshop.
Right.
But nonetheless, this is a wonderful, large, uh,
Wow.
full-size albumen of one that you cannot find. This is maybe only
Wow.
one of maybe two that are extant. But Booth, a great actor, and although Edwin was better, I think, but he was a ladies' man, certainly. But he was not the only one to want to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. So tell us about
Right.
Thomas Conrad. What
Yeah,
happened with him?
Thomas Nelson Conrad, he was a discovery for me at least as well too. He had been a private school, private academy teacher in Georgetown before the war, and there were lots of pro-Southerners in Georgetown, particularly in Washington, D.C. When the war broke out, he encouraged his students to cross the Potomac and join the rebel army. But he also had planned to murder uh, uh, Winfield Scott, the aged early commander of Union armies. The Confederate government caught wind of it. They weren't opposed to Conrad making an assassination, but they were worried if he killed Scott, there might be a more able younger replacement. So that connected him. He dropped that plan, connected him with them, and then he becomes an agent in the Confederate Secret Service. And one of his jobs, because he knew Washington so well, was to stalk Abraham Lincoln, who during the summer months would not live at the White House, but would live at the soldiers' home with his family. But he would commute back and forth on horseback, and he would often go alone. And so, Thomas Nelson Conrad would hang out at Lafayette Square, make notations of when Lincoln left, when he came back, what route he would take. And the plan was that to kidnap Lincoln. So there were other plots that, I had not really heard of, but events, one night riding into the soldier's home, a gunman shot a hole through Lincoln's top hat, almost killed him.
Yeah.
And Lincoln kept that quiet. So there were plenty of people along with Booth who wanted Lincoln out of the picture.
Um, I want to show, maybe because I want to show this, but also that'll help me get to another character that it just briefly comes through, but I want to ask you about him. And that is this wonderful photo by
Wow.
Henry Warren that was taken on the balcony of the White House, of the Executive Mansion.
Right.
And as you can see, Lincoln, I was told when I first came in, Lincoln was squinting and looking like that because the sun was in his eyes and wind was in his hair and eyes. I have a different take
Oh, what is it?
because Warren, who took the photo, an Army photographer, he was there at the Executive Mansion to take Tad's photograph,
Right.
but he used Tad to get to his father.
Oh,
His
God.
father was not happy.
Right.
And damn if he was going to give this guy a nice photograph of himself. So that's why he looks like that. But you say, and I'd like one example because I think it would be interesting for all of us, that Tad was a keen judge of grown-ups.
Right.
In this sense, he missed. He
Right.
didn't get it with
Right.
Warren. But can you give us an example of that sentence that you put in?
Well, one thing I wanted to do with Tad, and this again was kind of taking fresh eyes, for lack of a better term,
Mhm.
at some of this material. I'd always been taught that sort of Tad was this little brat and a little terror. And he was certainly a rambunctious, high-spirited young man, but he was also, Lincoln's bodyguard said that he thought that Lincoln was closer to Tad than anyone else, and Tad didn't like it. He was fooled this time, but he didn't like it when people you gave him stuff as a way to get to his dad. He absolutely despised Secretary Stanton. He once doused him with a hose in the White House garden
Yes.
and things like that. But Tad would often go to one of the butlers at the White House and ask for a few pocket change to give to a beggar out in front of the White House. He could befriend any animal. He was a remarkable and young man who had a lot of problems, a cleft palate. He difficult to listen to and talk to, but there was a sense that you had that he was almost like an old soul, that
Hmm.
Tad was somebody who saw a lot more in people than one would expect of a kid so young.
I appreciate your bringing Tad out for us like that. Lincoln, you mentioned in one area, was suffering, perhaps, or most likely, I think you say, was
Right.
suffering from cancer near the end. What evidence is there for that?
Well, the evidence for there is that, and one thing I'd like to say is thank goodness that, and I don't want to offend any of my fellow professors, but thank goodness that the Civil War has never been the sole property of academics, because there are wonderful amateurs out there who devote significant portions of their lives to doing really, really great historical work. And I relied on a gentleman named Arthur F. Lew, who was
Yes.
worked for an insurance company to help, unwrap to me the mystery of John Wilkes Booth. But there was another man by the name of
In his book, Booth Day by Day.
Doof Day by Day, which is a
Yes.
brilliant piece of research. But there was a gentleman named Soto. I can't remember his name, but he's put out I think it's a 600-page volume, and it's basically the medical history of the Lincoln family, not just Abraham Lincoln, but all the members of his family, his parents, all of that, and really studied very carefully certain symptoms, done a photographic study, all of this stuff, and came up with the idea that Booth, a very rare form of cancer, that and it makes an argument that he had it, but it is a go-to source for anyone, I think, in the future in terms of trying to deal with Lincoln's physical ailments. And he made such a convincing argument to me that I thought, there's a real high probability that this guy is right.
let's get to the Secret Service, maybe at both sides, but you really hone in on the Confederate Secret Service. Jacob Thompson, Robert Cobb Kennedy, and others.
Right.
And the new warfare, you say that Jefferson Davis decided to place on the North. And I thought as I was reading what this new warfare was, I was thinking of the Dahlgren Kilpatrick raid,
Right.
which doesn't make the book, which is okay. You couldn't get
Right.
everything in. But I once had a telegram. I handled the telegram for Lincoln ordering Kilpatrick to come into the executive
Oh,
mansion,
wow.
explain himself, which
Right.
he did. So I thought, well, there is the beginning of his assassination. If Jeff Davis said, well, if he can do it, I can do it. And of course, Dahlgren paid the price, not Kilpatrick. He
Right.
stopped north of the
Right.
city,
Right.
and Dahlgren went in with the papers. But nonetheless, what was the new warfare that you speak about, and Jeff Davis may have been behind?
Well, I think it was simply the realization, I'm sure the other generals realize it as well too, that the as costly as the wilderness and Spotsylvania were for the North, they were not as costly, but in some ways more costly for the South because everyone knew in this Davis and everyone knew that the more populous North could replace its losses. The South could not. And there was a battle of attrition that if they're going to fight that, they're going to lose their independence. And they desperately in 1864 want to survive as a nation. Into 1865, they're trying to survive as a nation. And so they realized that, the way to do this is we have to keep moving the needle of public opinion in the North. We need to put more wind in the sails of the peace movement of let's just let the South go. Let's just be done with this thing. And the way to do that, in my belief, if you look at the whole thing, is they launched a terror war against the civilians of the North. It's based out of Canada and Montreal. Jacob Thompson has $500,000 to play with. And while many of these things didn't succeed, if you look at them in the aggregate, the raid against St. Albans, Vermont, which created absolute terror across New England, uh, you know, the capturing of a ship on Lake Erie with the idea it's going to attack shipping. Most famously, the attempt to burn down Manhattan. That if either the pyrotechnic had been better or if the agents had been better trained, may well have worked.
You
So there
did
are
a
a lot
great,
of things.
you did a great part, by the way, in the book on that. That
Oh,
was a
good.
wonderful part that really brought out what the terror was and how close it came.
Right, and there were other efforts that put into. There was the doctor in Bermuda who had bought up the clothes of victims of smallpox, who then planned to sell them at public markets, resell them at public markets in the North as a way to create an epidemic. Whether that could have happened biologically or not, but there are a lot of things going on. A plan to blow up the White House allegedly. You have a professor who was a Marylander at taught chemistry at Columbia and Princeton, goes south once the war breaks out. He's trying to invent poison gas at the end of the war. So there are lots of efforts that are going on. They're trying to fight in any way that they can, and they realize, Lee, who is most brilliant when he could be mobile, is stuck now. His army is stuck. We've now got to find new ways to fight.
Let's talk about books for a moment.
Sure.
You certainly talk about Come Retribution, which was a book by in '88, I think, 1988. William Tidwell,
Right.
James O. Hall, and David Gaddy. It's a controversial book
Very
still, I think,
controversial.
but Come Retribution and the Lincoln assassination to kidnap Lincoln, to bomb the executive mansion and other plots.
Right.
So there's that book, and there's also one that you didn't really speak of, but is part of it, Baker's book on the Secret Service
Right.
in the North.
Right.
And then, of course, you do speak about John Headley's memoir,
Absolutely.
Confederate Operations in Canada and New York. How reliable are those two last books for you when you looked into them? And Come Retribution, being controversial, what do you feel about that?
All right. So I would divide them in two different ways. Come retribution, that was a labor of love and it was a lot of hard work. But I will tell you, frankly, it is one of the worst written books I've ever read. It is an absolute agony to read through that book. It was not edited to any degree. Things overlap. They do that. You have a couple of non-professional writers, former intelligence agents who are working on it. But, in my estimation, you have to look at what the evidence is, and certainly there's more in other books that came out as well too of documented collections, and you have to look at it in the aggregate and try to figure out is this a likely event? Is this a possible event? Because we have to remember that the Lost Cause, in particularly, just rewrote how the history of the Civil War. You know, certainly in the late 19th century, certainly in the 1860s and in decades afterwards, the average citizen of the North fully believed that Jefferson Davis and the others were all involved in the assassination. Certainly the prosecutors did, but they couldn't prove that fact. But what happens if you look at a lot of Confederate memoirs, there's a lot of changing of things. Like, was Conrad simply out to kidnap the president, or was he out to kill him? And a lot of that gets smoothed over, and you have to look at that with a very careful eye. The thing about Headley's book, and Headley is going to bend over at times to make it seem like we really didn't want to hurt anyone or anyway, but there's such good detail when he describes where he was at a certain time, how they crossed the Mississippi, how they slipped out of Mississippi into Tennessee, all that stuff that just rings true. So you have to put it through those kinds of eyeglasses. The fact of the matter is I make a case that John Wilkes Booth didn't think up the idea of assassinating President Lincoln, nor even think up the idea of kidnapping him. And there's no one smoking gun on that, which is going to bother some people, but there's a lot of smoke. And if you put all the smoke together, and if you see it in a larger political and military perspective, I think there's a very persuasive argument to be made that the Confederate government certainly wanted Lincoln to be out of the picture and dead, and that they were willing to invest time to see to make that happen.
Well, that's all laid out in the book, and I think that it's worth a reader going over it and understanding all sides of this issue, which we really don't have a firm grasp on, as you say, smoke, but no smoking gun. I just want to thank you for page 247, where you mention a certain Chicago bookshop, and appreciate that very much.
Absolutely. You deserve to be there.
Well,
Absolutely.
appreciate it. As I say, there are reasons why there's no Millard Fillmore bookshop. I'm always curious why there's no George Washington bookshop. Maybe after America 250 next year, someone will come up with that. But meanwhile, we're the bearers of it. And very quickly, because I see Bjorn here, that why the Civil War, as you say, is so important. It wouldn't be America 250 without it.
Yeah.
Without the Civil
Absolutely.
War keeping what the founders and our fathers wanted and holding on to it, Lincoln being the progenitor of that, we may not be doing this next year. We may be having the South doing what they're doing, and we doing what we want, New England doing what they want, and maybe the Midwest being somewhere too. It could have been a fractured
Yeah.
country. So, but appreciate the shout out.
And also, your listeners should know too that while your focus is on the Civil War and Lincoln, you also have a marvelous collection for sale of other presidential history. You have books on the Revolution and other things. I mean, this shop. You've got to go. Look, Chicago's in the middle of the country. You can get there someday, but it is a shrine to our past, and I think in many ways it's also an important player in the preservation of our democracy. I can't speak more highly, and I'm not doing this to try to, engender sales. This is from the bottom of my heart. It's amazing what you all have done.
Well, truly from our heart, we appreciate those kind words. And like the Emmys or the Oscars, unlike them, we haven't paid a cent for that. So, but thank you for that very much and appreciate your being with us on this. I enjoyed the book immensely, and I think everyone will as narrative history, whether you know a lot or you don't. Enjoy this book. It's wonderful. Bjorn, please, what do we have from your end?
Sure. Well, I'm not going to stop Scott from continuing to say nice things about Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
I'll even
So,
say nice things about you, Bjorn. So,
so we have plenty of time for that. Hey, I want to let you know we have had a lot of engagement from our customers and from people watching this live stream. It's been a very successful one as far as people watching. So I just want to give a shout out to some of the people who are
good.
watching and thank them. And we have a question. So you're going to have to answer at least one more question here today, Scott. But first of all, I want to say hello to some of the people, especially our regulars that watch. Bill Gorski has been watching from Arlington Heights. Gene Hutchison is watching from Byron, New York, says hello. Got a couple of comments. Clinton Stockwell says, I love the intelligence and sophistication of these interviews, first rate. So informative, well beyond what I thought I knew. Thank you, Clinton. We're going to hire you along with Scott to say nice
Yeah.
things to us. Bill Donahue says, I like readable history that is challenging, well documented, and reliable. We are all armchair historians at heart. So thank you for that, Bill. Ricky Newport has a question, a comment and a question for you, Scott. So I'm going to go ahead and pitch Ricky's question right now.
Great.
Ricky says, I just started reading Midnight on the Potomac today, and I am already halfway through. I have read several books on the subjects covered, but this includes lots of new to me facts and quotes from contemporaries. It's a great panoramic portrait and a great read. Among other things, there is a very convincing portrait of John Wilkes Booth in all of his complexity, including that he was considered a brilliant actor by his contemporaries. The question, when and how did the depiction of Booth as a failed actor emerge?
Well, I think it gets solidified during the era of the Lost Cause, which is this movement again to rewrite the history of the Civil War. Uh, Davis and Stonewall and Lee are now no longer, traitors, but they're going to become American heroes. Okay, the war is no longer going to become about slavery, but it was a unfortunate squabble between white cousins over states' rights and things like that. And there was a problem, there was a problem in terms of how Booth is going to fit into this because you can't whitewash or romanticize the assassination of Lincoln, all right? And so one thing is to divorce Booth from it. So that's really when this notion that he's this second class, second rate actor who's living in the shadow of his far more famous father and brother Edwin is but again through these amateurs, this incredible gentleman the late Arthur F. Lew, who spent decades in the pre-internet, pre-newspapers.com era finding every single review of a play that Booth did, every document, and documented it. And as I got that book and started reading it, the the critics just raved about Booth. And you more you read, you realize that his performances are selling out, from one end of the country to the next. People are turned away at them. And he realized, and reading memoirs by actors that acted with him, you're realizing this guy was not a loser at all. He's not some, prototype of a John Hinckley or a Lee Harvey Oswald. He's a brilliant actor who introduces all this physicality to the
Yeah.
American stage. He was also rational. He's not a nut. He's also racist and a white supremacist and things like that. But he's also somebody, as Clara Morris, who acted with him, said he couldn't have organized anything. I mean, he's obviously a pawn in someone else's game. So that was the most surprising thing to me when I was starting to look into this era. And once I realized that we've got him largely wrong in terms of his personality, that sort of opened the door to trying to take a closer look at where his involvement was and who he knew. And what you realize, he has all of these contacts with these Confederate agents along the way.
Excellent. Well,
I,
thank
I
you.
want to,
Go ahead,
excuse me,
Dan.
Bjorn, I want to ask a question from
Sure.
before, and that's about amateur historians, amateur, who
Right.
do a pretty good job. Um, and I'm wondering what academia thinks about it, because not only amateur historians, but I don't want to. This is a good thing. Journalists have come in as well. Maybe
Yeah.
they're amateurs to academia, but they know how to tell a story because they're journalists. They know how to do research because they're journalists
Yeah.
and reporters. And that's what's also been coming in. How does academia look today? Have they changed at all? Because I know when I was growing up and coming in the early years here in the shop, they didn't especially care for the amateur, but I saw very good writing and research by them, and more today.
No, absolutely. You can make an argument that the best in many ways, in some ways, if not the best, but some of the best historical writing of the last 50 years has been done by journalists who are doing work as historians. You could talk about Catton, you could talk about Robert Caro, and lots of people like that. What generally happens is those books don't get reviewed in historical journals.
Hmm.
They get ignored, though no, not always. I think that there is still some snobbery in the academy towards those folks, but there's also jealousy of their sales. The
Uh,
average academic book sells maybe 300 copies.
yes.
And you've got books out there. Isabel Wilkerson, who is an academic, but she's also a journalist. Her The Warmth of Other Suns, about the history of the Great Migration, it sold 500,000 copies. I mean, so they are reaching audiences that academics traditionally don't reach. I'll tell you a funny story. Taylor Branch, who wrote the wonderful 3 volumes about America during the King years, Pardon the Waters, won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, whatnot. The American or the Journal of American history sometime later dedicated an entire volume to writing about him, which was very, very unusual. And he came and spoke at my department, and one of my colleagues brought him up and said, "Well, Mr. Branch, what did you think about that?" He said, "I have no idea. I've never looked at it." So, I mean, in some ways, it kind of goes both ways in that, the journalist historians aren't studying the scholarly journals, but they are studying the same primary sources and secondary sources that academic historians do too, but they're not interested in theory. They're not interested in things like that. They're interested in telling stories and teaching, making a compelling way of teaching history that regular folks will read.
And that's why 500,000 books versus 300,
Yeah.
although academia, the presses still are now publishing these 300 books at $70, $120.
Yeah, or
So where are you going to
online,
go?
and yeah, they're not available. I mean, it's a problem. They're obviously both are very important. I'm not knocking that at all,
Positively.
but there is a
Make
great
it
divide there.
accessible.
But I think the amateurs, there are some amateurs who desperately need the help of a writer to help them with their book. But
Yes.
but there are people who are really dedicated to this, and they're open-minded. They're not just out to grind their particular axe. And Arthur Liu was certainly one of those people. James Hall. There's some others like that who've done just terrific work. No question about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, both of you. And thank you, everybody who has watched. Dan, do you have anything to send us off?
Well, just to show that we have signed books, directly signed first editions while they're last. We're still trying to get some more for because we've had such a tremendous outpouring for this book, and we're soon going to be out of the first edition. So get yours now if you wish it, and read a good book at the same time, signed by the author. But if you miss that, we will have our signed book plates that Scott was kind enough to put together for us as well, and we appreciate that. So we thank you.
There you go.
Bjorn, will you
Hey,
take us out?
yeah, I am going to take you out, but I am going to add one thing to what you just said, Dan. Do love those directly signed books, and since you started talking, in offering the directly signed books. The one you just held up is the last one. So, so they're
Oh,
sold out. But as you said, we will give you more details on this in the near
yes.
future. But I think you can count on getting a chance to have directly signed copies of Midnight on the Potomac again before, say, the holidays roll around. I think
Scott
there
has
could be a
said he
good
would come
chance
in
that we're going
once
to be able to
again
do that.
Coming.
into the shop.
I got my
Yeah.
pen ready.
Wow.
Excellent. All
Maybe I'll
right,
keep
everybody.
this one.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The price is $75 now. No, no, we're not going to do that.
No.
But thank you everybody for watching. Thank you, Scott, for joining us. Thank you, Dan, for running this interview. I've been Bjorn Skaptason with Daniel Weinberg and Scott Ellsworth, and we will see everybody else. We will see all the rest of you next time on A House Divided. Bye.